Good morning, everyone. My name is Caitlin Yager. I'm the Director of Heritage Programs for Missouri Humanities, and our mission is to enrich lives and strengthen communities by connecting Missourians with the people, places, and ideas that shape our society. Thank you so much for joining us today for Chapter 2 of our Explore Missouri's German Heritage series, an 8-part series that delves into each chapter of the book of the same title by W. Arthur Mehrhoff. The series will continue every second Thursday of the month at 10 a.m. from now until April. The book is available for purchase as well. I'll be posting that link to buy the book in the chat box on Zoom and in the comments on the Facebook Live video. They are $25 each, and all proceeds will help us to continue to bring free public programs such as these to Missourians. Whether you're joining us through Zoom or watching on Facebook Live, we invite you to interact with us throughout the program. If you're on Facebook, feel free to comment to let us know you're watching or to ask questions for us to consider. If you're on Zoom, feel free to use the chat feature or the Q&A feature to submit questions throughout the program, and we'll address as many as possible throughout the next hour. If you enjoy our program today and are interested in seeing more from Missouri Humanities, please check us out on Facebook or on our website for the most up-to-date information about our events. We also have a membership program where benefits include free books, discounted tickets to special programs, and access to members-only events. To become a member, visit www.mohumanities.org and click the Donate tab. After our program today, I'll be sending everyone an email with a link to our program survey. I would really appreciate it if you could all take some time to let us know what you thought about the presentation. These surveys are really important to us as we continue to bring public programming to Missourians and work toward a more thoughtful, informed, and civil society. Now, with all that said and done, I'd like to turn this over to my co-host for this 8-part program series, the author of the publication, Dr. Arthur Mehrhoff, and he will introduce our special guest today. Arthur, take it away.
I'm unmuted, right?
Yes.
All right, well, that makes it easier. I am Arthur Mehrhoff, and we keep using that term, author of the publication. I'm the author of the publication, but it is very much a collaborative effort. I want to continually emphasize that, and in fact, we'll even prove that point this morning with our guest as well. And just a little bit of background in case you were not here last time, and it ain't all about me, but I think it's valuable to at least know who your wilderness guide is as you enter some new territory. W. Arthur Mehrhoff, I have a PhD in American Studies, American Culture Studies from St. Louis University in St. Louis, Missouri. And I worked as a museum educator and involved in historic preservation and tourism development, community tourism development over a long period of time. I'll just leave it at that. And my particular emphasis in American culture studies, which many anthropologists study sort of small communities, think of Margaret Mead and Samoa, but it's a little bit harder to turn the lens on one's own culture, but that's really what American culture studies tries to do. So my focus has been on American attitudes toward the natural environment, toward the land, if you will, and in particular material culture studies, what our artifacts tell us about ourselves. As one cultural historian used the phrase, the beer can by the highway is pretty much explains American culture, if you think about that. But I also worked as a museum educator at the Gateway Arch, Jefferson National Expansion Memorial in St. Louis, and also for 10 years as the museum coordinator or educator, academic coordinator at the Museum of Art and Archaeology in Columbia, Missouri. And that's where I got involved with Missouri Humanities and its German Heritage Initiative, and participated in the steering committee, planning committee, if you will, that was involved in helping to guide that effort, and also in some very important academic symposia, or not even academic, but symposia combining academics and professionals in that particular field, and trying to bring together, if you will, sort of the academic and the applied aspects of how do we understand Missouri's German heritage. If you look, there's a foreword by Dr. Steve Belko from the Missouri Humanities in the foreword of the publication, and I think he does a good job of giving you the orientation of how this project came about. So I was pleased and privileged enough to participate. And when I say I'm the author, but not the author, this was a very much a collaborative effort, has been, and hopefully will continue to be, as it spreads out throughout, not just the German Heritage Corridor, but I hope others will see their heritage, not just German heritage, and see this as a model for how we could, in fact, kind of weave the past, present, and the future together. And that's how I got to know our guest this morning, Dr. Petra DeWitt. DeWitt or DeWitt? How do you pronounce it? DeWitt. All right.
DeWitt, yeah.
All right. Anyway, I won't give you all of her background, but she has participated in the steering committee and the scholarly symposia, and as far as I know, still teaches at in Rolla at the Missouri State School there, and I believe political science, or is that still in?
In history, I'm teaching history courses at Missouri S&T, the old UMR.
So what I'd like to do at this time, since I've already kind of introduced Dr. DeWitt, is to ask her if she would just talk a little bit about her background as it relates to this Missouri's German heritage, and how you got involved in this particular initiative.
Okay, I'm interested in the history of German Americans because I'm an immigrant myself. I come directly from Germany. I arrived 35 years ago this year. So I married an American GI who was stationed over there, and I followed him over here. I became interested in the history of German Americans when I was doing my master's degree at Truman State. The books we were assigned to read about World War I history, in essence, said that German culture was exterminated. One book actually used that word, exterminated, during World War I.
Wow.
And I said, no, 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 just go to Westphalia in Missouri, just go to Herman in Missouri, go elsewhere. And people are still celebrating their German heritage. So what I then did for my dissertation, which eventually became a book, was to study the impact of World War I on German Americans. And of course, I had to study the whole history of German Americans. So when the Missouri Humanities approached me to participate in the German Heritage Corridor initiative, that was a natural that I would say, of course, that I would become part of that, both as a historian and as a preserver of artifacts. I've participated in a couple of the preservation events where we photograph several artifacts, be it old certificates, be it letters, or any other artifacts that people bring to us, and we preserve them for the future generations.
I do want to mention, if you look at the bibliography on page 147 of the Explore Missouri's German Heritage publication, in this particular section, chapter 2, that Dr. DeWitt's book, Degrees of Allegiance, is one of those recommended or select bibliography. So she's an ideal guest to help us look at, if you will, the history of the arc of what's happened to Missouri's German cultural heritage, but it's not extinct yet.
No, no, but not by any means, no.
Well, Petra, you've said a lot about your background, and that really, it ties into this chapter so well, because this chapter talks quite a bit about how conflict and German Americans kind of intermingled in Missouri history. So kind of to start us off, Arthur, orient us a little bit to this chapter. Touch on the writing process and how you decided to start off the book with this theme. And if I'm correct, the title of the chapter is Marking the Spirit of the Times, correct?
That is correct.
All right. Der Zeitgeist, I think, is what the chapter title in German is. That's probably the only one I'm able to pronounce, but I'll try from here on out. So yeah, Arthur, orient us a little bit to this chapter's theme and how you went about writing about this theme.
It's what in classical mythology or Greek antiquity they would call in media res. We begin in the beginning, and the first essay looks at the statue of Alexander von Humboldt in Tower Grove Park, and you wonder why there. Well, if you look at the arc of Missouri's German cultural heritage, it's kind of a meteoric rise, if you will, from immigration, if you will, the origins, primarily in the 1830s and 40s, and then reaching kind of a crescendo with the Civil War and after. And then World War I changes everything. And then finally, after a period of, if not quite extinction, at least suppression, that really since the perhaps late 60s, maybe 70s, there's been a gradual and I think important revival of interest in Missouri's German heritage. That was basically the premise or the theme that emerged from some of these workshops that we participated in back, what, 2-3 years ago. Kind of lost track of time, but you know, why should I be different than anybody else? And there were a number of historians, including Dr. DeWitt, who participated in this, and there was a real strong emphasis on this, what historians might call periodicity. Are there distinct periods in Missouri's German cultural heritage? And we believe there is, or it seemed to emerge that way. So partly as a tip of the cap to the all the historians there, but also because that arc, if you will, that whether it's the periods or in a narrative arc, it's kind of like a rags to riches to rags story, and hopefully now, if not riches, at least resurgence. And so using a couple of those humanities themes, I decided, well, let's try it out and see how it applies to cultural artifacts. And again, as I mentioned last time, history is everything that ever happened, okay? So we have to sort out. We have to stand somewhere. And so using the approach of artifact analysis, choosing some key artifacts that provide, if you will, dense facts. Think of Ken Burns' great documentary on Brooklyn Bridge. You know, it brings so many things together, and that's really what we're trying to do here. It's modeled, since I was working as an academic coordinator at the museum, upon Neil McGregor's famous book, The World in 100 Objects. It's based upon his efforts at the British Museum okay, how do we make sense of all this? Well, we can't write about everything. So let's look at key artifacts from their collection. And so the idea was, okay, I've got about 150 pages to tell this story. So how do we do it? And we better go in deeply into a few key things rather than try and tell the entire story. And so that's why, starting out looking at the history, which I think reflects the efforts of the symposium, the steering committee, but also I think using some key objects or artifacts that, to me, you know, a monument, to bring to mind is the Latin phrase, and that's what it does. And with the Humboldt statue, he went from cultural hero, not just for Germans, but really he was a worldwide, he was a rock star. And now his star is ascendant again. So, but for a period of time, that monument was neglected, vandalized, and has been subsequently restored. And now people are paying attention to Alexander von Humboldt in a very big way. And I hope that the same mark applies to Missouri's German heritage.
Yeah, and I think too, as we were kind of going over a lot of these themes, because there's, each chapter is a theme, but then of course inside the chapter is more themes. And, one of the big ones that, the three of us were discussing as we were preparing for today is the idea of cultural authenticity and how to maintain one's culture through conflict, especially when the conflicts we're talking about included having Germans on the opposition, and in a very big way. There was this, as Petra said, when she was studying, they used the term extermination. That's how much of an impact these world wars had on German cultural heritage, not just in Missouri but nationwide. So we came up with these, I guess, 4 stages of German culture in Missouri. We had this development period, when German immigrants were coming into Missouri and really developing that culture, starting businesses, and it maturing. And that maturity, we were saying, kind of peaked right before World War I. And then as World War I started, and then the in-between, and then World War II, we get this this assimilation, or this kind of going into hiding. I'm not sure what the best term for it is. I think extermination, like Petra said, is a bit extreme.
Yeah, I'd say it went into the underground.
Into the underground. Mm-hmm.
Countercultural.
Right, and then eventually, this resurgence. So, talk a little bit. I think, and I think both of you obviously have ideas to contribute to this, but kind of the development of those 4 stages and how, various conflicts attributed to those. So whoever wants to kind of give us their thoughts on that.
I mean, I could start off, give Arthur a little break here, but you can chime in anytime you want to. We have these 2 or 3 major waves of immigrants coming in during the early 1800s. So we start in the late 1820s with the first ones who are making Missouri their home. They're sending reports home to Germany. They publish books. You then have a wave in the 1830s because the economy is very bad over in the German states. We have to remember there is not yet a Germany. There are German principalities. And people come from a variety of regions based on primarily economic reasons. You have some coming from Bavaria, you have some coming from Westphalia, you have others coming from Prussia, and they are beginning to settle in areas along the Missouri River, what we today define as that heritage corridor. Then you have another wave coming in the 1840s and early 1850s, the so-called 48ers, who were part of a revolution in the German states. And now you have others coming from Baden, for example. I'm thinking of Franz Siegel, Karl Schurz. So they're coming yet again from another different Germanic region. So you have this hodgepodge of Germanic people coming to Missouri. But then in the second time period after the American Civil War, they become German. They did not necessarily call themselves Germans previously, but they become Germans after the American Civil War. They have contributed to the American Civil War. They fought on the side of the Union. Indeed, they were instrumental in assuring that Missouri would stay in the Union. They prevented Confederates from gaining control over the arsenal in St. Louis at Camp Jackson. And they were very much outspoken abolitionists in opposition to slavery. They were not necessarily advocates for racial equality, but they were definitely against slavery. They associated slavery with despotism, with serfdom. So they were opposed to that in Europe, and of course they are going to be opposed here. So it's this age of maturity when you really have major businesses coming to the forefront, being run by these Germans. And of course, beer always comes to mind first, right? That's at least the reference that I make to my students here. So you have Anheuser-Busch, for example, becoming a major company. This is the height of this time period between the American Civil War and World War I, is the height of German community, as you pointed out, Arthur. This is when it's the strongest. Students are still learning German in schools. If you go to church, be it Catholic church, be it whatever Protestant faith you belong to, you hear your sermons in German, right? Lutheran ministers indeed argued the only way you can really understand the word of God is if you hear it in the German language, that there would be something lost in translation, right? When it goes over to English. So
I have to add that in our family, phrase was God's first words were Adam, wo bist du?
Yeah. So this was really the height, but we see something changing by the turn of the century. And that change will really go into overdrive when we have World War I coming about. Because you have individuals like the future President Theodore Roosevelt arguing about 100% Americanism. So there is a nativist kind of nationalist movement happening by 1900. And the German people, the German Americans, they've been here now for 3 generations. They still speak German. They've been very much integrated into American society. They very much believe in the right to vote, be participants in the political process. But there is also a parallel to that, this nativist nationalist movement beginning to develop, and it will go into overdrive during World War I, okay? So so that was the second phase, this maturity phase. And then we have this attack, in essence, this harassment of German Americanists during World War I. In part, this grows regionally, locally, but also it is being agitated by government legislation, by government action. Indeed, when we, the United States, do not participate in World War I until 1917, right? So very much 3 years into the war is when we finally get pulled into it. Even though there had been agitation to get involved previously, but we're still sticking to the Monroe Doctrine. As long as you're not involved in our affairs, we will not be involved in your affairs in Europe, right? But once we get closer to the war, already in 1916, during the presidential election, Americanism is being discussed. Who is a true American? Who is not a true American? So that is part and parcel of the presidential campaign already. So once we then finally enter the war, government institutions like the Committee on Public Information create a propaganda, well, they called an education campaign. Today we call that a propaganda campaign, right? Yeah, that defines anything associated with the enemy, Germany, as being bad and anti-American, right? So while initially that education campaign talks about what is bad about militarism, what is bad about the Kaiser, that then very quickly translates in the United States on the home front into, why are you still publishing newspapers in German? Are you hiding things? Are you plotting with the German enemy to invade the United States? Are you going to share some kind of secrets that you have learned about the United States with the German enemy. You need to publish this all in English, or you need to, through the Trading with the Enemy Act, need to file a translation with your local postmaster, right? So you have this pressure, this push to demonstrate your Americanism. And if you're not 100% American, then you must be supporting the enemy. You can't be somewhere in between, right? You can't live in a gray area, if you want to call it that, right? And immediately a cartoon comes to mind from one of the St. Louis newspapers, where you see a German newspaper, you have a little snake with the Prussian military helmet on it, and then you have a foot with 100% Americanism stomping down on the snake on the newspaper, right? So very graphic messages to everybody who reads the newspaper that German needs to disappear in the United States. So a lot of people felt that pressure to no longer speak German, no longer subscribe to the German language newspapers. It didn't prevent them from speaking German in the home, right? It didn't prevent them from maintaining their holiday practices, like don't open the presents on December the 25th, but do it on the evening of December the 24th, right? That's the German way of doing things. So you're still maintaining some of these habits, but it's in the privacy of your home. It's no longer out in public, right? And of course you have tandem to this all happening, also a prohibitionist movement growing. It started in the late 1900s as a temperance movement. In other words, temper yourself, control yourself to alcoholic consumption. But by the 19-teens, that had developed into a full-blown out prohibitionist movement. And who were the people who were most open about their consumption of alcohol, especially on Sunday afternoon in the beer garden, right? So they become the natural targets of that prohibitionist movement at the very same time, as they're also being told, speak in English, get rid of your German.
The temperance movement called itself 100% Americanism. I also wanted to mention that if you, in the publication, Missouri Life and our graphic designers did a great job of adding those kinds of images that Petra just alluded to. So sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words, and there are a couple in there that will definitely grab your attention.
Mm-hmm.
Which having an historian here makes my job so much easier. And it's a mark of respect. They're much better historians than I to call upon. And what I always tried to do was to try and provide some context, some culture, if you will. There's no one definition of culture. I think anthropologists or social scientists have something like 70 or 69 different operational definitions of culture, and authenticity is the same way. But basically, culture is how a group, whether it's Samoan Islands or a big industrial society, structures the world, the view of the world, whether it's your whole collection of symbols or whether it's your whole way of life. And language is a big part of that. As Ludwig Wittgenstein pointed out, we basically live in different language worlds, and who controls the language has a lot to say about whose world it is. So, one reason why we call this chapter the Zeitgeist, it's a very much a German romantic term from the turn of the 19th century, the spirit of the times. And I think it's valuable to note that Petra, if I may refer to her as Petra, talked about, they came over as members of different regions, but there was this strong spirit of the times, this zeitgeist of rising nationalism, and especially if you were a peasant or a struggling artisan in somebody's fiefdom, some feudal little lord, arbitrary rule. The idea of having some sort of a strong national government, and they'd seen it with Napoleon and how the laws and courts and administration was regulated. So there was an appeal of that kind of nationalism and national identity. And those 48ers that you talked about, I think very much brought that spirit of the times with them to America. And then following the Civil War, people like the Roeblings, who built the Brooklyn Bridge, or in my hometown of St. Louis, I lived on Fladd Avenue. Henry Fladd was the chief engineer for Eads Bridge, and an American of German descent. And this nation building and railroad building were seen very much in those terms. So it's very much a part of the the rising tide of nationalism, and Germans contributed vitally to that. You mentioned some big names there. And so by the turn of the 20th century, German American culture posed a genuine cultural alternative to, if you will, sort of the traditional white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Anglo, heritage. And people didn't always take kindly to that. And in fact, Theodore Roosevelt, good old Teddy Roosevelt, one of my heroes about the national parks, spoke very much against what he called hyphenated Americans during the First World War, or the run up to it. So that struggle over who is an American it's not just contemporary newspaper headlines. It's been going on for some time. And the question of authenticity very often depends upon who's in power, who's in charge. And I also wanted to mention the example of Hamburg, Missouri. World War II, I don't think there was much discussion that Hitler and Nazism were bad. And my family, the Hirschhausens and Sickmans and Mehrhoffs, etc., all went off to war and came back as good old GIs. And I'm one of the results of that post-war phenomenon. But Hamburg was a German town near Highway 94, and basically the Department of Defense claimed it, wiped it off the map, and built a munitions factory there. And it's odd to go back to a Hamburg alumni reunion or a town festival for a place that no longer exists. So not cultural extinction. The memory's there, people still celebrate it, but like you said, it's very much a private, familial kind of celebration. So you did a great job of summarizing in a few, really short period of time, a lot of history.
Yeah, we do a lot of things in the name of conflict and coming out as victors, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't necessarily debate what the long-term outcome is going to be, because we react on the spur of the moment. But then it is up to us historians to think about the past as we are evaluating it, and hopefully teach some lessons to be learned for the future and not to make the same mistakes again.
So we have a couple comments and questions kind of to the current conversation. One is a comment from Angela, who says her great-grandmother, born in 1899 in Dutzow, Missouri, which is one of the first German settled communities in Missouri, actually. Her great-grandmother spoke of this elimination of things following World War I. She said the German newspapers in Missouri were wiped out, and then she said she would make a movement with her hands, and her tone was stern, not something grandma would do often. She would also tell of only being able to speak German before lunch in school, and that otherwise they were punished. So that's I think it's so important to have those personal stories from attendees from some of these presentations, because, it's one thing to have a professor or a panelist, dictate history to you. It's another thing to have one of our attendees tell us a personal story. And that really brings it to a new light. And I think what's also really important to note here is that these shifts in cultural or in outward, expressions of culture or activity, it's not hundreds of years ago. It's not something that we can just read about in history books. There are people alive today that remember this stuff, or one generation removed. We take it upon ourselves as the Missouri Humanities Council to try and document the stories while we still can. Our oral historian that we share with the State Historical Society, Sean, one of the projects between the two organizations is to document oral histories of people who have these stories of seeing this shift firsthand, and remembering when all of a sudden they weren't teaching German in school, remembering that, their mother said, make sure you don't speak German, outside of the home. And something that I think, we kind of touched on when we were, discussing this chapter is that this shift and this kind of, banning of German culture is a little bit more prevalent in bigger cities. Places like St. Louis that had a bigger population, a more dense population, and a more mixed population of ethnicities. It was a little bit more, I would say, obvious that they were trying to hide Germanness. But when you were in a community, maybe in a more rural area that was more concentrated German, you might be more careful out in public, but it was a little bit more, I think, comfortable to express your Germanness because you knew that you were among friends. And I think that's an important distinction, that there was a big difference between, those that lived in a city versus out in rural Missouri.
Well, as an urbanist, I can speak to that. Sociologist Robert Park from the University of Chicago back at the turn of the century coined the term invasion and succession. He looked at the struggle in Chicago, his home, where he was living, as a struggle between different ethnic groups for access to resources, for political power, turf, if you will. And it plays out in, a neighborhood changes, for example, maybe it's one group and then another group starts moving in. So the city is this constant clash of ideas. I think it's more open to change simply because it's based upon such strong market forces that have to be open to innovation. Smaller towns, perhaps not so much, that you can, there may be just the background is a strong ethnic heritage, and most people who live there maybe share that, maybe even familial or clan relationships. So I think there's a lot to that, the stresses that came in living in a big city.
Absolutely, absolutely. And when you look in St. Louis, you actually see the Germans arrive in very particular wards that they live in initially. But then as they are economically succeeding, they're moving further and further westward away from what we call downtown today, right? So they're beginning to move outward. And as they are beginning to move outward, they become also more Americanized in their actions, in their political behavior. They need to fit in to be economically successful, right? Whereas Herman is totally different, right? Herman is entirely made up of Germans and subsequently German Americans. And what is so interesting there during World War I is that German Americans are in charge of the local government, right? And it is the sister of the mayor who goes out to encourage her fellow German Americans to be more American, to not outwardly be opposed to the war, to put enough money to buy Liberty loan bonds, to buy war saving stamps and so on. And she's at the forefront of trying to demonstrate that these German Americans are really 100% Americans, right? So it's that internal community leadership that is trying to demonstrate that we are Americans, even though we're also Germans at the same time, right? So demonstrate our Americanness, do what we need to do, then they will leave us alone and we can go back to reading our German newspaper, the Advertiser, no, not the Advertiser, the Volksblatt. And it actually survives into the 1920s. In St. Louis, the Westliche Post survives into the 1930s, okay? So they're not immediately wiped out, but because more and more people do convert over to the English or American language, the subscriptions begin to decline, and that is then the reason why the newspapers go away, okay?
I never thought of it that way, about people weren't speaking German as much, therefore, even if there was a German newspaper, their readership would have been lower. That's an interesting point.
Yeah.
And that relates very well to something you said last time, Caitlin, about you had the sense that there was a lot of history underfoot that you just didn't recognize or didn't sort of come to the forefront. I think the Camp Jackson incident or that sign is a good example of that. But my experience and that of Petra's are kind of instructive because they're very different. I'm a child of one of those GIs, fought in World War II, excuse me. I'm not that old, sorry. But, it's partly the sense of, we don't want to push our Germanness, but it was also the rise of mass society. It wasn't just Germans who were losing their ethnic identity. It was the melting pot. It was the period of Mad Men, if you watch that TV program, of mass consumption society. And I think that there was an attempt to create kind of a standardized American culture. And so ethnicity in the form of Germanness, it had already been under some stress, and it went through this sort of universal solvent. And it really wasn't, for me at least, until the 1970s, the bicentennial, doing the Roots, if you remember Alex Haley's famous program. It affected not just Americans of African descent, but a lot of people started taking their roots more seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And the bicentennial, I think, encouraged that historic preservation. And Missouri's German wineries, especially in Augusta and Herman, had already started to go through their revitalization. So there was, if you will, kind of a focal point for some of that, which that's kind of where I cut my teeth, besides in St. Louis. Going to Herman, driving along 94 on a beautiful autumn day, that became kind of a little pilgrimage, almost like a medieval pilgrim looking for a piece of the true cross. We're looking for cultural authenticity. We're looking for, some really good wine on a beautiful fall afternoon, and it's evolved since then. And part of what this effort is an attempt to create some balance, if you will. There are plenty of things about my German heritage I don't celebrate, and I'm sure that's true of just about everybody. But what's worth keeping? That's really what we're talking about here. What's worth keeping? What are the heirlooms that can help us all, to survive and prosper? We kind of need to take that seriously now.
So a few more really great comments. One that has a two-part question. The other are some personal family experiences and other comments. And then I'm going to take your cue, Arthur, and talk about this whole idea of what's worth saving, what's worth remembering. So Kathy Schopenhorst, who we all know, hi Kathy, Der Friedensbote was published in German in Missouri until 1958. It was the newspaper of the German Evangelical Church. So 1958, that seems to me that's a pretty late kind of cutoff for no longer having a German newspaper. That they lasted quite a while. Fran says her in-laws family is from rural St. Charles County and said they faced a lot less of that discrimination since the area was so populated with Germans. So that's, an example of what we were kind of hypothesizing, which is that, you maybe didn't feel that discrimination as much if you were in a more heavily German populated area. And rural St. Charles County is a very densely German populated area. Teresa has quite a few personal anecdotes. She says there's a Kill the Hun poster in Hermann's Deutschheim or the Pershing Museum. It was hidden near a bathroom 5 or so years ago. Her great uncle began school during World War II and was hit with a stick when he spoke German, which was the only language he knew. So that's poignant. What do you do when that's the only language you know? You might have learned a little bit of English, but that's your first language. It would be like asking us to speak the language that we took for a few years in high school. It's just not something we can do easily. And said that he told her later in life after she majored in German. At Schubert's St. John Lutheran Church, there were agents outside listening during World War I. German Americans were discriminated against, and there was a Missouri decree during World War I and World War II for not speaking German. Yes, that's correct. There was an official decree that said that it was banned to speak German in public, and that her grandparents were considered traitors for speaking their native language. So very real life, very poignant examples of some of the discrimination Germans faced during this really tumultuous time. Teresa also has a couple questions. She says, one side of my family immigrated to Missouri from southern Germany between 1852 and 1890. I learned in Missouri museums that there were 2 reasons for opposition to slavery. So this is kind of calling back on something that Petra touched on earlier, which was that, more often than not, Germans were pretty staunch abolitionists, but not necessarily for racial equality. So, and this might lead into that, which is her question is, 1, that the more educated opposed it based on human rights, and 2, farmers opposed it based on the fact that it made competitive prices difficult because they paid their labor. Petra, you're nodding your head. So she asks if this is correct. So do you want to comment on that?
That is absolutely correct. Yes, absolutely. So you have individuals like Carl Schurz, well-educated, newspaper man, eventually Secretary of Interior for the United States. He is very much opposed to slavery based on ideological terms, that this is just plain inhumane, that you should not own another human being, right? Whereas if you're talking about your ordinary farmer who may have bought 40 acres or something like that, they are competing with other farmers, right? And there were actually statistical evaluations published in the 1840s newspapers that if you owned 1 slave, you on average had a profit that was 40% higher than if you worked for yourself. And they already understood that in the 1840s, 1850s, and they published that information in the newspapers. So you as a farmer would have looked upon this as a serious competitive institution. Perhaps not necessarily looked upon this as inhumane, but you looked at your bottom line and you said, that's not fair.
Mm-hmm. So I want to take this opportunity, actually, hold on, someone just gave us a comment. They're from Iowa, and she doesn't know if her great-grandfather was fluent in German, but he always said the table prayer in German at family gatherings. His grandson learned it, and then she still requests he say it to keep the tradition alive. So great example of maintaining that cultural heritage, and what I think Arthur touched on, that just because it's not out in the open doesn't mean that the culture is not there. And that's a prime example of that. But we've talked a lot about kind of the assimilation, acculturation that Germans faced. But I want to switch gears here to this, the shift towards the resurgence. So we have several decades between the end of World War II and when I think Arthur and Petra, we were talking about maybe 70s and 80s is when we start to see a shift towards, starting to re-celebrate Germanness. So talk a little bit about that shift and what that looked like. How did we transition from all that we just talked about to being able to celebrate German culture, such as Germans' contributions to Missouri's development? We talked so much about Germans' role in Missouri political life, lots of German governors and senators and legislators, contributions to industry, to business. So how do we get to where we are today, where we can talk about how important Germans are to our state without being called, a sympathizer or a traitor? And I say that, everyone says, I guess, that time heals all wounds, but what was it that started the healing process? Talk to us a little bit about that.
If I may step in here before Arthur, I think it had a lot to do with the 1960s, when historians are beginning to write in more depth about the contributions by immigrants to the United States, not just the Germans, but by Scandinavians as well, by African Americans, by all kinds of other groups, how they have contributed to American society. We also begin to change our immigration laws, being much more open to allowing Asians and Latin Americans to come into the United States. It's the very same decade where we have that major immigration law change, right? So we're becoming more aware of our ethnic diversity. His name escapes me right now, but he was Speaker of the House at one point, and he had actually issued a major study of our ethnic diversity and how we had been not necessarily a melting pot, but that American society represented great diversity. So we're becoming much more aware of that diversity in the United States in the 1960s and definitely in the early 1970s. Okay, so I think that is one of the major reasons. Once we begin to talk about our diversity, you then begin to demonstrate where you come from. You become more aware of your roots, as you were saying, Arthur. So it's not a coincidence that roots comes out at that very same time period as we are talking more about our ethnic and racial diversity, as we are, in essence, telling all our different stories, how we are important segments within American society, right? So I believe that's where it all begins.
I would agree as far as the zeitgeist, if you will. The 60s and the 70s brought about a different zeitgeist, a different spirit of the time. Those people like my parents who went through the Depression and World War II, there was tremendous emphasis upon Americanism, Americanization, national unity, a national system, because you needed it in order to survive, quite frankly. Perhaps it's a function of the great wealth that was generated, after the Second World War, but there was leisure, there was more education, and the ability and interest in looking at different aspects of American life. So the shift sort of swung from the unum to the e pluribus, and we do that all the time in American culture. I think that's part of what the humanities helps us to understand. But so as you pointed out, the rise of, instead of great historical tomes that look at the main sweep of American history, there's a lot more interest in different cultures, different ethnic groups, more specialized kinds of studies, and help to bring about a rising interest in ethnic identity. Think back to the films of the 70s, The Godfather 2.
Yes, absolutely.
But I mean, it's a look into Italian American culture, and so it wasn't just the German culture. Also, the United States had invested heavily in the Marshall Plan in helping to rebuild Germany, and I think there was also a recognition that we don't want to have the same thing happen that happened after World War I. And I think that, and I also want to say that Germany, to its own credit, has taken, in terms of interpreting its history, it hasn't whitewashed it at all. I mean, it's put it out there, and has also, I think, taken leadership in trying to, look at its response to the immigration crisis. So I think that I have to, there is a wonderful example, an artifact that I think illustrates what I'm all about here, that the capital of the key building, the government building in Berlin, the Reichstag, was burned during the Nazi period of dominance, and it's been rebuilt. It's award-winning design by Sir Norman Foster, a famous British architect, and so it restores that building, but people, you're able to walk around and look down upon the government. So it's not like you have to look up at government. And in the center, there's this dome, and it's a symbol of, its commitment to solar energy. I mean, it's just one of the most incredible examples of, one, respecting your past, but also looking into the future as well, interpreting that past. So the meanings of that experience have constantly changed. So I think that it's less, we're removed from, the smoldering ruins of World War II, and things look different now. So I think that, that has contributed, I think, to a sense that we need all of the help we can get to survive what's happening now, and to build a more healthy, robust, humane, inclusive society. So we'll take it where we can get it. And I think Missouri's German heritage has a lot of, I call them heirloom seeds, that I think still have a lot of vitality.
A few more comments from some of our attendees. So a great example of people who kind of adapted, Germans who adapted to this ever-changing period. Sherry's great-grandmother dropped one of the N's at the end of the family's surname so it did not appear so German. My last name, which is my married name, but is Yager, Y-A-G-E-R. That is not the way the Germans spell Yager. It is very much an Americanized version of the word. So that's a very common example, is people trying to make their names appear more English. Let's see. Someone wants to know, and I would be remiss to not ask this, just with what we're talking about with Germans in political positions, the highest ranking US political leader of German heritage. I mean, I would assume that we have a president somewhere down the line that is probably mostly German or very German. I can't name one off the top of my head, but
Henry
I
Kissinger.
don't know how you could not.
Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
Well, I would think Dwight D. Eisenhower from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania might qualify.
He might qualify as a president, yeah, being of German American heritage, yeah. Even Pershing has a German in his skeleton in his closet.
Well, and one of our attendees, Krista, she said Eisenhower as well. So I mean, I don't know how he would not be. So we've mentioned St. Louis as a German city. Liz wants to know about German influence seen in Kansas City, so our other big city in Missouri. I know that they have a German sister city. Their Hanover, I think, is their sister city. I mean, I personally I reference St. Louis because I'm from here. But can either of you comment on Kansas City's German heritage?
There were Germans and German Americans. They actually had a hospital that was called the German Research Hospital. So they had the German word in there. They actually got rid of it during World War I. And yes, St. Joseph also has a sizable German population. Nothing compared to St. Louis, but they were active. They owned businesses. They had publications, newspapers, and were active in their communities, active politicians. So, like I said, nothing compared to what existed in St. Louis, but they did have German communities.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also important to point out that the German Heritage Corridor primarily consists of 16 counties from St. Louis City toward Jefferson City and a little bit beyond. No disrespect to Kansas City, as Petra points out, there are these enclaves like Concordia, Missouri, that are strongly German, but they're kind of isolated spatially in turn. If we look at the map, and again, as we pointed out last week, the concentration of Germans, German Americans in this corridor, in the heart of the city along the Missouri River, was one of the reasons why the Civil War was so important, because they represented, if you will, the sharp spear of abolition in the midst of what was just basically a slave state. I live in Little Dixie here in Columbia, so you get the idea that it heightened those cultural challenges and tensions, perhaps because of that spatial geographic element.
So I'm going to let some more questions roll in as we go to kind of our last topic, which is going to go back to these monuments. So peppered throughout this chapter are various monuments in different forms. They're not all obelisks. They're not all bronze statues. We talk about street signs, churches, and sites. So something that I would like to discuss is how these have aged over time. So just as an example, we've got the von Humboldt Memorial, monument, which Arthur touches on, that went into kind of disrepair and was a bit neglected. And then kind of during this resurgence, it's now in great shape. The street signs are a very interesting topic to bring up. And Arthur, I'll let you kind of talk about what's happened with the street signs. But we've also had the Naked Truth Monument, which is a tribute to the editors of the Anzeiger, and the Friedrich Hecker Monument. So a lot of various monuments, using a kind of a loose term of monument, to various parts of German heritage in Missouri. So Arthur, talk a little bit about the monuments that you chose to feature here, and how have they aged over time since they were put there in the historical context of when they were erected, versus writing this book and putting down your research for kind of each of these monuments.
Well, they're not as shiny as they used to be, first of all, and they get this patina of age, but they also get a patina of meaning and layers of meaning over time as well. And as we've seen that, like the von Humboldt statue was the cause of great celebration, and it represented the sort of peak influence of German culture, if you will, on American life, and not just American life. I mean, this was happening all over the world. So German culture was very important, but then I think because of the cultural challenges of World War I and Prohibition, and, if you will, just a loss of historical memory on the part of American culture in a big way, not just about Germans, but we kind of lost our way a little bit, perhaps. And so I chose that because, to me, it was the most representative of this arc that we talked about in terms of the rising and falling, and hopefully now resurgence. The Italians have a wonderful word, risorgimento, and I love that. I don't know what the German equivalent is, but risorgimento, just, I love to say it. And so I hope that we have this risorgimento going on. Camp Jackson, you can see the changes in the city. And I think St. Louis University has done a good job of trying to bring to mind, which is what that word monument really means in Latin, mentis. So trying to bring to mind something happened here that we ought to pay attention to. If not with a big bronze statue, at least we can, and the tip of the cap at least, and the challenge of the signs. Who decides what names, how we name something, what name we give it, and what it says about us. That's, to me, that's very instructive, that there's a challenge still going on here about whose name we get to use. So if people don't see the connection to contemporary America, think a little bit more deeply, because it's always going on. This challenge of culture, whose reality is it, continues. And I don't think we still, I guess because we've seen too many statues and monuments that we've had to remove, that we're probably less likely to put up a bronze statue of somebody now. But I think there are ways to commemorate, to share memory with, especially with new technologies. Google Maps allows you to look at hundreds of years of a place like Camp Jackson, the area of Camp Jackson, just through embedded maps in a Google map system. So it doesn't always have to be in brick and mortar, bronze and stone. And I think we need to explore some of those ways as we try and commemorate our heritage, so that it's more inclusive, if you will, that other stories get to be told instead of just the one dominant story.
Absolutely. Petra, any contribution to that, or final thoughts as we kind of wrap up here?
Well, I was thinking about the Naked Truth Monument. It is a monument to really two things. It is a monument to three men who were newspaper publishers, right? But it is also a monument to truth, that reporting should be truthful. So it is a monument to an ideology, right? And I think it is so current that it still has meaning today when we are talking about fake news, right? So that monument still has that important meaning today, even so we can sometimes separate the men from the overall purpose that they were talking about, right? So for that reason, that monument is still important today.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts, either of you? I don't have any other questions. Sherry did mention that she is writing a narrative of her family history of her third great-grandfather who served in the Civil War and his immigration. Recently, I've been researching his name, Laborius. He was named after Saint Laborius. I found all sorts of Catholic churches and place names from Germany and Illinois and Missouri. It's great to hear that you're writing a family history. I think that's so important.
Yeah, if we didn't say it, we should. Thank you to everybody, one who's listening and or reading along, and especially thank you for listening carefully and sharing comments and thoughts and questions. That's what this is all about. I'm the author, but not the author of this publication. It's an ongoing work. It's a dialogue, and as Petra pointed out about that statue, it's a reflection of an ideology at one particular time, but Humanities asks us, what does it mean today? Okay, so how do we interpret that? And that's really what this whole effort is. It's an interpretive effort, what historian Henry Steele Commager once referred to as the search for a usable past. What still speaks and resonates today? So hopefully we found something here today that resonates.
Yes, thank you very much. And again, for the comments. Yes, those personal anecdotes are more important, I think, than our speaking at you, because it brings this to a very real place. And I hope that those of you that are joining us today continue to join us on the rest of this series. I know it's crazy to think that this is going to take us through April, because some of us can't even plan until next week. But you know, in this ever-changing environment we currently live in, but the goal is to keep this going monthly through April. Our next chapter in this series will be Thursday, November 12th at 10 a.m. That chapter is chapter 3, Oh Brave New World, and we will dive into a lot more talk about the immigrant history of Missouri, and the inspiration and the stories behind that. So I don't yet have a special guest for that chapter, but we will get back to you. And I'm sure it'll be another great discussion. Arthur and Petra, thank you so much for your time. You'll see Arthur again next month. Petra, good luck.
I'll be right here, actually. I won't move.
Exactly. Same here. So thank you again so much to both of you and to our attendees. Please
Thank you again, Petra.
Sure, anytime.
Petra, it's good to see your face, or an image of your face.
Okay.
If you guys want to hear more about or learn more about this program series, if you need to purchase the book, or if you want to learn about more events with Missouri Humanities, visit mohumanities.org or follow us on Facebook, and that Facebook page is Missouri Humanities Council. Thanks again so much. Keep an eye out for that program survey for Chapter 2, and hopefully we see you all plus more next time. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.
Auf Wiedersehen.